Welcome to the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission's State Preservation Grants Informational Session. We're really glad that you're joining us. And as I mentioned before, if you have the chance to update your Zoom name so we know who you are and what organization you're representing, that would be a great help. Or feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We will be using chat today to collect questions. If something winds up in Q&A, no problem, but we'll try to stick with the chat and I'll relay some of your questions to Katie. Several members of the commission staff are here today with us. I am Sarah Zurier from the Preservation Commission. I'm the Special Projects Coordinator. I'm joined by Katie Pomploon, who's the Grants Manager, and Arita Ademi, who's the GIS Coordinator, Liz Rochefort, who's Architectural Historian, Roberta Randall, an Architect. I think Ginger Hess, Architect, may be joining us later, and potentially later on, Jeff Emity, our Interim Executive Director. So welcome on behalf of all of us. And here's our format for today. Katie has prepared a presentation on the program and on the application process, and she has kind of broken out some spaces for Q&A, both with us or if questions come up with the RIHPHC staff, and I'll introduce them in a moment. I'll relay those questions to Katie and our partners. And if there's a follow-up question you want to ask on camera, we can do that too. But we're going to start with the chat. And I'll take the next slide, please. So the State Preservation Grants Program was made possible by all of us, the voters. We have approved 4 bond issues in the past 19 years to support grants for capital preservation projects at public historic sites, museums, and cultural arts centers, some of Rhode Island's most beloved historic buildings. So thank you, everybody. The most recent bond issue, which was passed earlier this year, provides $1 million for state preservation grants and $2 million for state cultural facilities grants. And I'm very glad that we're joined here today with our partners from RIHPHC. They administer the State Cultural Facilities Grant Program, which we're going to run this year in tandem with the State Preservation Grants Program. So you may be eligible for both opportunities. So welcome Randy Rosenbaum, Executive Director, and Molly Dickinson, who's the Grants Coordinator at RIHPHC.
Delighted to be here.
Yay. And so with that, welcome and take it away, Katie.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I just kind of want to give everyone a brief agenda of everything we're going to cover today. We are going to be talking quite a bit about eligibility. That's going to cover both eligible applicants, whether or not your organization can apply for this program, eligible properties, and eligible projects, or what we will and will not fund with this program. Then we're going to dive into the difference between a small project grant and a large project grant for this program. These differences, you'll remember these are matching grants. The difference between the size of a project is going to feed into that, and it's going to be important for you when you're putting together your budget. We're going to do a walkthrough of the application. I'm going to pull it up on the screen so you can get familiar with it, see all the different sections, and we'll talk about some of the questions that the application will ask. After that, we'll talk about the evaluation process, how the reviewers are going to review your application, what criteria they're going to be looking for, and sort of the calendar for review and determination of final awards. Lastly, we're going to go over some of the major requirements of the grant program should you receive a grant, and then just sort of next steps for wrapping this up and getting to the application phase. All right, so moving on to eligibility. To be eligible as an applicant, your organization must be a nonprofit organization with 501c3 status, a municipal agency, a state agency, or a federally recognized Indian tribe. No private applications, no privately owned properties. The applicant must be one of these 4 things. The applicant must own their property or operate the property with a lease or written agreement from the property owner. We do fund projects at leased properties. I know people have been nervous about that in the past. What we do is we review them on a case-by-case basis. You'll be required to submit a copy of your lease or written agreement as part of your application. You'll have to attach it in that application, and we'll review it. We'll make sure that there's sort of a commitment there from both sides that this property will continue to be programmed in its use. And we want to make sure that you have the property owner's permission to apply as well. So there'll be a separate form for that in the application, but leased properties can be considered. Another thing we have to ask about is whether or not you received money from the State Cultural Facilities Grant Program, RIHPHC program. If you received an SCFG grant in the past funded by the 2014 bond, that project has to be complete and closed out in order for you to be able to apply. The same actually goes for if you received a state preservation grant from our office and you have not yet completed or closed that out. There's very, very few of those, and I'm in touch with all of you, so I think we're good there. But just make sure that if you received former grant funds from that previous program, that those projects are done. So eligible properties. The property for which you're seeking a grant must be used as one of three things, either a museum, a cultural arts center, or a public historic site. These three terms are defined really explicitly in our program regulations. In addition to having a function as one of those three things, the building must also be historic. And we define that as listed or eligible for listing on the State Register of Historic Places. So what are these three categories? We've got a museum. So this is a historic structure open to the public, used to house artifacts, exhibits of historical, artistic, cultural, or educational value. Cultural Arts Center, also a historic structure open to the public, used to present cultural events such as performances of music, dance, or theater. Or a public historic site, a historic structure open to the public, used for events or activities of broad community interest and widely recognized as representative of the community's heritage. All of these, whichever category you fall in, you must be open to the public at least 12 times per year. So is your building historic? If you're not sure if your building's on the State Register of Historic Places, we have a PDF of the full state register available on our website. You can go there, look up your address, try and figure it out. If you're still unsure by looking at that, by all means, definitely get in contact with us and we'll try and help you figure that out. If you are sure that the building is not listed, but you think that it might have architectural significance and integrity that would make it eligible for listing on the State Register of Historic Places, you should also get in touch with us right away. We will take a look at either some photos you're able to provide and some historical or architectural information you're able to provide about the building, give you a preliminary sense of whether we think it might be a good candidate for listing. If it is, and you do have an eligible project to go along with it, you can apply, and then in October at our commission meeting, that information will be presented to the commission sort of for their concurrence on its eligibility. If they agree the building is eligible, the application will remain in consideration. If they do not, it will not. So a little bit of a risk reward there. So we definitely recommend you get in touch with us right away if the building is not listed and you have questions about that. Any questions here about eligible applicants or properties before we move on? I'll open up the chat here.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but it's a good time to enter your question.
Okay. Seeing none at this stage, I'm going to keep going. So what types of projects can we fund? The eligible projects are capital improvements, which are defined as preservation, restoration, or rehabilitation expenditures that permanently improve or significantly extend the useful life of the building. In addition to being a capital project, all work, so all activities performed as part of the project, must conform to the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. We maintain on our staff 2 staff architects, one of whom will be assigned to review and monitor each preservation project that gets funded, and they will be making sure that the entire scope of the project and all activities planned do meet those standards. So what are some types of projects that we can fund? This is an example, a list of projects. It's by no means exhaustive. Things like roof replacement, restoration of historic windows, masonry repointing, structural repairs, code upgrades, ADA improvements, mechanical improvements, siding repair, painting, interior restoration. These are all things that we have funded in the 2015 to 2017 grant round and would expect to see applications for again. Consultants fees, like for architects or engineers or planning consultants, consultant fees are eligible only if they are part of a larger construction project. You cannot apply to this program just for plans and specs for a future project. It's got to be one and the same. It's got to be part of the construction project at the end of the day. What won't we fund? So these are activities that no matter what, we cannot fund. Mitigation activities as a condition of receiving permits, new construction at all, unless directly related to the provision of disabled access. Reconstruction, can't recreate a building that we wish was still there. Projects for which the entire scope of work is just maintenance, landscaping or site work as part of non-historic improvements, unless directly related to the provision of disabled access. Again, we just talked about projects that are only pre-development, like plans and specs or historic structures report. Those things are okay, but only if they're part of a larger project. We cannot fund acquisition of property or collections or restoration of historical artifacts or collections. These activities, no matter what, even if the project becomes eligible, these specific activities we cannot fund. So any type of abrasive cleaning, application of aluminum or vinyl siding, use of inappropriate mortar, scrub coating of masonry, installation of inappropriate insulation, and replacement of original historic windows. We usually see requests for window replacement. We definitely want to see you apply for restoration. If we determine with our staff architects that the windows are beyond repair, they're beyond restoration, replacement in kind can be considered. Questions about what we will and will not fund?
Hi, I'm going to read a couple questions.
Great, thank you.
We have one that says, our Bell Schoolhouse Museum has typically been open a few hours on weekends during the summer. Because of COVID, we have been closed the past 2 summers. Would this affect our grant application?
Great question. So we're definitely, like everybody, we're very cognizant that COVID has changed the way most of you operate in the past 2 years. The application is going to ask for information about your major events, activities, audiences, number of visitors over the past 3 years. And what we actually want to see is sort of what's been happening in that COVID period as well. So we're hoping that's going to give us a sense of both the normal and what's been going on in the meantime. The fact that hours have been limited is not going to, necessarily hurt you. It's just something we want to see. And we understand in a lot of these situations, there could be small spaces. There's obvious limitations on who's going to be able to be there. So talk both about what you've been doing and then also use the application to speak a little bit about what you would hope to do with your restored space, your restored building in sort of the normal circumstances. If you're applying for something that is sort of responsive to changes due to COVID, talk about that too. Talk about how it would enable you to invite people back in the space, if there was something that previously had to be limited and now as we're opening back up, you might be able to, make the program or make the space programmed again. I hope that answers your question, but yes, we're very aware that, some people may have had to shut down for extended periods of time and it's not going to preclude your application. Anything else? Is that it, Sarah? Okay.
Here's another related question. Can you define open to the public, as COVID has changed a lot of our normally open door policy?
Sure. So that's the same sort of thing, I think, which is that we still want to see in our definitions, it still says open to the public at least 12 days per year. I would still hope that there's opportunity for that. But again, use the application to talk about those changes. I think when we get to the stage where we're reviewing these things, most of us will have our hats on of saying, these are long-term capital projects. The idea is that they are going to be benefiting the building in a way much beyond this current phase that we are in. And we do want to be able to say, in future, we'll be either back at capacity or back welcoming people in. So I think just talking about that in the application will be really helpful to us and to the reviewers.
Right. So I think I got this from RIHPHC. They say your application is your argument. So just put your best argument in there. And I think I see one more question at this point, which is, will there be a printout of this webinar? We are recording it. We will post it on YouTube. I'll check the settings once we're done. And if there's a transcript, we will post that as well.
I can also, if we just want the slide deck, we can put that on our website too. Is that good?
Katie,
Okay.
before you move on, there's one additional question in the Q&A.
Mhm.
I can read it to you. So that would
Yeah, I
help.
have the full screen, so I can't see them if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'll read it to you. It's from Nate Chase. He says, I received a grant in 2015 and had a password. I do not remember what it was, so I tried to obtain a new password. I failed. It seems I might have to start all over again to apply for a password as though I am a totally new applicant. How should I handle this?
Okay, so we'll get to that, I think, a little bit more when we talk about the application portal itself. The portal is hosted on RIHPHC, so you wouldn't have applied online for us before. If you've applied for a RIHPHC grant in the past, you might have had an account. So someone remind me to touch on that when we get to the application if I don't remember myself. Okay. Anything else in the chat, guys?
I
Yeah,
think
there
you're
is.
good to move on.
Actually,
Oh,
there's, I
yeah,
think,
one
one
more.
additional. Oh,
Are we good? Oh, you know what?
I can read the one from the chat, this new one from the chat.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I have it, it's in a funny format. The work we are seeking to do is to restore a building on our historic property. Does the fact that the entire property is open to the public all year address the 12-day public availability? Or does the specific building need to be open?
The specific building needs to be open. So if you have a site with sort of like a campus of buildings, the building in question needs to be accessible to the general public. Okay. I actually managed somehow to get the chat to come up on my screen as well. And I see one more in here that didn't get read out, which is, can you confirm painting would be short-term maintenance? Yes. Sorry, let me kind of go back on that one. Painting it depends on sort of how it falls. The regulations define short-term general maintenance, I believe, and I'll have to go back and double check, as a 5 to 7 year sort of window. Painting can last longer than that, and we have funded painting projects before. This would be most likely an entire building painting project that could count as an eligible cost. We don't necessarily want to see touch-up painting projects or patch repainting projects, but especially a project for an entire building that would also be potentially part of a larger project, it could qualify beyond sort of the maintenance category. Sorry if that was confusing there, but I would apply for it. Anybody else? Looks like we're good. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Next on the agenda, small project versus large project grants. So the SPG application is going to ask you to provide information about the grant project versus the entire project. So the grant project is what you're going to do with the grant funds and the matching share. That's going to be your project that you're planning to accomplish with the grant. The entire project is the grant project plus any other activities that are happening concurrently with other funds. Oftentimes, most of the time, these things are one and the same. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes someone is taking on a very big project. They're only carving out a specific piece of that to be the grant project, but they also need to then, in that case, report to us what else is going to be happening with the entire project. The dollar value of the entire project is going to determine whether you have a small or large project grant. So a small project grant is for an entire project value of $75,000 or less. The grant request in this case can be up to $50,000, and it requires 2-for-1 match. So for every $2 in grant assistance, you provide $1 of your own matching share. And for small project grants, we can approve some in-kind contributions like volunteer services or donated materials. Large project grants are for an entire project value of $75,001 or more, so over $75,000. The maximum request in this case is $150,000. Applicants must match these grants in cash only on a 1-to-1 dollar-for-dollar basis. So what we recommend in this case for these projects, you want to define your grant project really carefully. because if your grant project costs more than $300, the match will include any additional dollars to complete the project. So, for example, if you have a $400,000 grant project and you get the maximum grant of $150,000, the matching isn't a true one-to-one because the applicant must provide the $250,000 balance to match the grant and complete the project. Questions about small projects and large projects?
Yes, we have a question from Karen Catugno in Narragansett. As a coastal town, we have concerns about climate change and rises in sea level as they impact historic properties. Can grant money be used to install preventative measures to protect properties from future impacts? If not, are you aware of any such grant programs?
Wow, I would say we have not funded that to date. I could see where one might be able to make the argument that preventative measures for flooding or what have you would be, eligible capital expenditure. I just can't say we have done that before. Where it might get tricky is if you're talking about something like raising a building. That might be something that we'd have to really look into if it's appropriate, if it's something that's appropriate under the Secretary of the Interior standards. I wouldn't wholesale say it's not eligible, but it would definitely require us to look into it a bit more.
Great. And then we have some more questions from Kathleen Carland. Is this match for small projects the same as 2014?
The match for small projects is the same. The threshold for small projects has been raised a little bit. So from 2015 to 2017, the small project threshold was $45,000. Anything above $45,000 was a large project. We bumped that threshold up in this most recent iteration of the regulations to $75,000. But the 2-to-1 match requirement for small projects is still the same.
Okay, from Ryan Brennan. Does a pending application for a matching request from another grant maker count as in cash for the purposes of the application for a large project?
Oh, okay, I think I see what you're getting at here. So when we say the match for a large project has to be in cash, we mean we won't accept donated materials or volunteer services as match. As a side note to that, we would want to see in your application that you've applied for another grant that would potentially be used as match for your project, but you would note in the application that it's not in hand. I think so. There's a slight difference in terminology there, but yes. So when we talk about cash match for large projects, we just mean no donated services or materials can be accepted as match.
And we got a great thank you on that one. Any other questions coming in about small projects and large projects? Please add them to the chat or we'll let Katie move on.
Okay.
Looks good.
Sounds good.
Oh, one more from Randy. Can you match a state preservation grant with another state grant for?
Great question, Randy. So we allow other state sources of funding. We do not allow you to use funding from the State Cultural Facilities Program as match. So we spoke a little bit in the beginning about how SCFG and SPG have a lot of overlap. Some of you may actually be eligible for both, but if you're eligible for both and you apply for it and receive both, they cannot be used to match each other. So in that case, you'd be talking about a very large project where SPG funds one piece and has its own match source, RIHPHC funds another piece and has their own match source, but they cannot be used to match each other because they come from the same bond. They're essentially the same funding. Okay, we'll move on. We'll talk now a little bit about the application itself. Let's see. So, great news. The SPG application process has gone entirely online in 2021. We are thrilled and we are very grateful to RIHPHC for this. They are hosting the application on their grants management site, which is really, really helpful both to us and I hope to you guys as the applicants to not have to worry about physical copies and mailing multiple copies in. I'm hoping this will be a really big improvement. So the application is hosted on their site. Don't be alarmed by the fact that it says State Council on the Arts all over it. When you go to this link right here, which is also posted on our website, you are in the right place. So Nate, I believe you asked earlier about needing a logon for this. If you have, like I said, if you've received a RIHPHC grant in the past, you may already have one, in which case you can use the same one. You don't need to create a new one just because you're applying for SPG. If you've never created an account before with RIHPHC, please do so. It's super simple. If there are issues, like a forgot password, there are some lookup features, Nate, like there's a, forgot password link over here. So, I'm thinking there's probably a way to reset that. If you have trouble with it, shoot me an email and I'll get in touch with the folks at RIHPHC and see if there's an account issue or something like that. But for the most part, I think it should be pretty straightforward setting up an account in this system. So there's 3 major components to the application. There's the application form itself, a budget worksheet, which must be completed separately and attached to the application, and then required attachments, which have to be uploaded to the application as well. So I'm going to take a pause here to pull up the application and kind of walk through it. Before I do that, I think I am seeing some activity in the chat. So is there a question I should answer before we walk through the application, you guys?
Sure, if you'd like. Here's a question from Redwood Library. We have the oldest extant garden structure in America, Abraham Redwood Summer House, designed by colonial architect Peter Harrison on the grounds of the library. Up to now, we've used it as a gallery. You don't enter, but peer into. Its current state precludes displaying things to be viewed inside, and it's at the moment too fragile to have people milling around inside anyway. That said, it has functioned as public art. From what I'm hearing, it's a bit of a tweener, and yet it's super important architecturally. Can you give me a read on where we'd stand?
Yeah, tweener is a good way to put it. It's super difficult, right? Because a very significant building. Where we would kind of land on that is, can you go inside? And if you can't go inside, that's kind of going to be the cutoff. So the law is pretty clear that we're funding museums, cultural arts centers, and public historic sites located in historic buildings. So it makes it a little bit tricky. I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about that one, but yeah, it's on the fence there for sure.
All right, we have another question. This relates to timing. So I don't know if you'd like to take this one later.
Okay, yep, that sounds good to me.
Okay. And here's another one. We have a balance from Champlin to commit our end of the barn. This is at Borders Farm, but having trouble getting a contract to commit. How does this affect us with this application?
A contractor?
Yeah, I think that's what it means, contractor.
Oh, so I would, if you have Champlin funds in hand, I would include that as match for your proposed project if the application you're submitting to us would be for that same project. I mean, I don't think you could necessarily just reroute it. I'm not entirely sure, but it wouldn't necessarily hurt your application to say, we've got an in progress project elsewhere. That would be fine.
Yeah, definitely. You can always send an email of intent to Katie with some details about your project if you want a quick read on eligibility of your property or your project. But in many cases, we're going to encourage you to apply because we would love to see more applications and more opportunities to share this fund.
Sure.
So I'm going to save that other question for the next section.
Okay. So I'm going to pop out of here and we are going to share the application. Okay, so when you do log in to the RIHPHC site, you will see a list of all of their open applications at the current moment. So it could be a little lengthy. You'll just have to scroll through and find the one listed here that says 2021 SPG State Preservation Grant. When you click on that and you choose to apply, this is what you'll see. So the application is broken down into these different sections. There's a little bit of length to it, but it shouldn't be too heavy of a lift. I would recommend that you work on it in pieces and save as you go. You don't have to, by any means, do the whole thing in one shot. Perfectly capable of saving, coming back to it. And let's kind of get started here. We've talked about the eligibility a lot already, but we wanted to sort of front the application with those eligibility reminders again. So we want to make sure right off the bat, you are an eligible organization, your building has an eligible use, and it's listed or eligible for listing on the State Register of Historic Places. So you'll answer those 3 questions right off the bat. If you're unsure still at that point about any of these answers, get in touch with me. And then also there's a little reminder here about RIHPHC. You may still be eligible for both, so consider both if you are. After that, we've got this little reminder here of the State Preservation Grant Guidelines. This is a document that will sort of also walk you through the application, and it's available on our website as well. There's a link to it right here. Highly recommend reviewing that document in addition to having attended this session before you get started. There's also available for download on our website those 2 budget worksheets that we talked about. So there's going to be a small project budget worksheet and a large project one. You only do one based on the size of your project, but you do have to download it separately from the SPG website, complete it in Excel file format, and then later in this application, there will be an area where you upload it into the online portal. So we start out with asking some general project overview questions. We like to get a brief synopsis of 1 to 2 sentences of what you're hoping to accomplish, what the total cost of the project is, and what the amount of your state preservation grant request is. We also ask you here to indicate who the primary contact for the project will be. Make sure this is someone with an email address who checks it regularly and is comfortable communicating back and forth with us that way. Make sure it's one person. We want to have a single point of contact who we can just sort of rely on for the application stage of the project. We also ask for the project's location, address, city, town, and zip code. Immediately following that section, we want to ask about your elected officials. This is going to be really helpful to us because we're hoping to be able to advocate for this program in future. And letting your elected officials know that this project has received funding from the State Preservation Grant can be super helpful. So please let us know. And if you don't know off the top of your head, which you might not, you can very easily look it up using this link right here, Secretary of State's website, their voter information center. You put in your address and voter information and it'll come right up. Next, we ask about your building. So we want to know the historic information that you have. So date built, original use, who the builders or architects were, if you know, and a nice description of the architectural, cultural, and historic significance of the building. We then want to know about the building's current use. So whether it is, you'll see on the dropdown, museum, cultural arts center, or public historic site, and how many years it's been programmed in one of those 3 ways. We're going to also ask some questions here about accessibility. So I know this makes people nervous sometimes because they say, oh, my building's not accessible under ADA. Does that mean I'm not eligible? No, it doesn't mean you're not eligible, although we would love to see improvements made for ADA accessibility. We definitely want to see you use this space to talk about what barriers there are necessarily to providing ADA access and any alternatives you offer, such as a 3D tour or video or something like that, that allows people with disabilities to experience your space if they can't necessarily get in the door, or if they can't necessarily get in the door yet. Then we ask a little bit about your relationship to the building, whether you own or lease it. This will be the section right here where if you do not own the property and you have a lease or written agreement, you're going to need to upload a copy of that lease right here. So moving on, project information and timeline. So here we want a description of the grant project. Again, that's the specific activities that will be funded by the grant and matching share, and what you hope to accomplish with those activities. Here is where we're going to have you upload the budget worksheet. I'm going to walk through that separately after we go through the rest of the application. If the grant project is part of a larger project, so activities that are not being funded with the grant or matching share, but are happening concurrently at the same time, you need to note that here, that it's part of a larger project, and then describe the entire project in the narrative field here, just so we know what else is happening at the same time. Then we would also want to see an estimated timeline for the project. So you can enter dates here for when you would hope to have planning and design done, when you would hope to identify qualified contractors, select them, start the project, and wrap things up. For this, assume a 2-year project period beginning in 2022. So don't, if you're going to be applying October 1st, let's not, say we're going to be getting everything done and ready by, spring, because it's probably going to take a little bit longer than that, especially on our end, getting everything set. signing funding agreements, etc. So assume projects starting in 2022. Let us know what your project costs are based on, whether you've received formal estimates or if it's just sort of based on, a perceived need. And then move on to physical need for the project. So in this section, we really want to get a sense of what threats or risks there are to the building at this time. If the building is extremely endangered, explain these causes and how they developed, but use this field to just let us know what the preservation needs are, what the threats are, and what this project will potentially help do to mitigate them. And also describe your building's maintenance program. So do you have regular maintenance? Do you have regular maintenance, regular budget for maintenance? How do you maintain your buildings just in sort of a general way outside of these one-off grant rounds that we have? Next, we ask about impact. So impact of this project, both on your organization, your audiences, and the community where your project is located. If you're a membership organization, we like to know about that. So we like to know if you are memberships and how many members you have, whether you have paid or unpaid staff. We like to see a description of that, and whether there are personnel costs budgeted. I know a lot of you guys are actually volunteer groups. Your historical societies of the world don't necessarily usually have paid staff. So talk here about volunteers versus paid staff. And then more fully describe how your building is used as a museum, cultural arts center, or public historic site. Talk here about your mission, the audiences you serve, and how the building really contributes to your community. Get into the detail about programming. What sort of exhibits does the museum have? What sort of events or activities would your cultural arts center or public historic site put on? And let us know some details about visitation and access. We touched on this a little bit earlier, how we know that the last 3 years have been completely absurd. So it's going to be a wide range of responses in this field, but I think that's going to be really enlightening for us to see both your normal operations and how things were handled during COVID. So definitely don't worry about, showing information here that says we were closed for a long period of time, because we understand that. Then we want to talk about how the project would impact your organization itself. So how does preservation fit into your organization's long-term plans? Do you think that this project might help you reach new audiences or expand your reach into the community at large? And will completion of the project allow you to expand your own programming? That would be really important to know. So we also ask for some information on the impacts on the state or local economy. So if you anticipate that the project will lead to increased revenue or attracting new visitors or audiences or other economic impacts, try and just report those here, because that would be really great to see as well. And then how will you plan to engage a broad and diverse community, or how will this project help you increase access or engagement with historically marginalized groups? This program, we are very much trying to advance the goals of our new state preservation plan, and we want to make sure we are equitably distributing funds statewide. So we'd definitely like to hear more about that here. Oh, and letters of support. I'm glad I saw that there. This is another spot to add an attachment. You can upload one PDF file here that includes up to 3 letters of support. So these should address, the value and importance of this project to your community, and they can come from audience members, local government officials, what have you, but people who use the property and who experience it as a museum, cultural arts center, or public historic site usually write the best letters of support. Okay, then we're going to dive a little bit into the financial and organizational health of your organization in the capacity to succeed section. So here, again, we know we're going to see a lot of information probably related back to COVID, because we're going to be asking about your major fiscal challenges, achievements, or any changes to your budget within the past 3 years. So again, that's probably going to be quite a varied response. And that's, again, okay. So if you have had major fiscal challenges due to COVID, or if you've potentially seen income, due to COVID through grants or other sources, we'd like to hear about that here as well. Here you're going to have a few more attachments, such as a recent budget report. This one is a little trickier for the nonprofits. So my state agencies and municipal agencies, we'll talk about what you can include there, but this is more for your nonprofit documentation. Again, for nonprofits, we would also like to see your most recent IRS 990. Describe a little bit here your fundraising experience. Again, thinking over the last 3 years and how that experience will complement fundraising for this project. And similarly, whether you have past experience with grants or other capital projects. We would definitely like to see you, have had this experience in the past, but I don't want to worry anybody into thinking, oh, I've never done a grant funded capital project before. You're not going to be eliminated. We definitely just want to hear about past experience with similar types of projects. Lastly, after you get through all those narrative sections, you'll be right here at the last sort of attachment section. So here's where you want to have gathered that information already. So it's easy for you just to hit upload on these. For my nonprofits, again, a copy of your IRS determination letter and board of directors. If you have architectural plans for your planned project already, you can upload a reduction copy of them here. That would be super helpful. Required is 5 photographs for every project. 1 should show just sort of the general view of the structure for which you're seeking a grant. And then 2 through 5 should show target areas and conditions that you will be addressing with the grant. So whether it's areas of damage or areas where you have your planned restoration, that's what we want to see. And then for optional support materials, this could be just about anything. The easiest way to do this, if you have other materials that you think might be helpful to us, like press clippings or audiovisual material, would be to use this text box to include a link to where that material might exist online, whether it's in sort of like a shared drive or something like that. That could be really helpful to us. And if you can't, include links to online, there is an option to upload a file here with more information. It would just have to be one composite PDF file of other materials that you think are relevant to your application. And you can use both of those fields there. So once you've got everything there complete, we get to the last step, certification. For leased properties, you have to include that approval from your property owner. So the property owner's assurances form is available on that same space on the website, on our website where the budget worksheet is. So you'll download that, get your property owner to sign it and upload a PDF of that here. And then lastly, you're going to certify that you've read all the guidelines, everything is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge, that if awarded a grant, you're going to follow all the terms of the SPG program. Click the little checkbox there and you're ready to submit. So that's the online application. I'm going to pop back out of this here so we can talk a little bit about the budget, unless anyone has questions about the fields itself first.
We have a couple general questions that
Okay.
I'd like to toss at you, and then a couple I'm going to reserve.
Sure.
So I'm going to start with Kathleen Carland and Anthony. You're in the queue for the next section. Kathleen asks, if a project qualifies for RIHPHC and the commission, what is the recommended process for determining which part of the process would be for which agency? For example, handicap access and restroom in a historic space.
So again, this would be for a very large project, because if you're applying for both, you have to match both separately and they can't be used to match each other. So if you've got a very large project for ADA, accessibility in a historic building, we could speak with RIHPHC about which pieces would make the most sense in advance if it would be helpful to you. I wonder, Kathleen, about the size of that project, if it would make sense to apply for both, or if it would make more sense to apply for one.
And
Okay,
Kathleen, if I can jump in.
Yes,
Oh,
please,
yeah.
Randy.
So it's Randy at RIHPHC. First of all, thank you, Kathleen. Second, often it's a determination on how the building is used, as opposed to support for the historic characteristics of the building. So I would tend to say, and this is by no means fast and loose, that the something to support the ADA accessibility for bathrooms, for example, would be a use type of activity, whereas repointing the bricks on the building itself would be an historic preservation related kind of thing.
Yeah,
I hope
that's
that
perfectly
makes sense.
And that would be another great case for an email of intent, and then we could even share some of your ideas about a potential project with our partners at RIHPHC.
Yep.
So one more question, also RIHPHC related, from Andy Long. Can a space be both a museum and a cultural art facility?
Yeah,
A museum is a cultural art facility.
yeah, definitely.
All right, so I'm going to save a couple more questions that have to do with timing and the budget worksheet.
Okay, perfect.
I'm sorry, can I amend my previous response and say an art museum is a cultural facility? If
Yes.
you're an historic museum, that's another kettle of fish.
Perfect. Okay, so I am going to pull up the budget worksheet then, so we can take a look at that. Okay, so the budget worksheet is an Excel file. Can everyone see that okay? And like we mentioned before, there are two different ones, one for the large projects, one for the small. This is super important because there are formulas preloaded in this file to make your lives easier that correspond to those different matching rates for small and large projects. So when you open up the budget worksheet, you're going to enter your different activities in these categories that you see here. So we have non-construction activities, construction, site work, which is not eligible for grant, but would be included as part of an entire project if you have a larger project, exterior work and interior work. So what you basically do is in the narrative fields here, you would put in your activities. So here we might say, you know, architect's fees, you put in the cost, and then you enter here a Y or N for yes or no, whether it's included in the grant project. So we say, yes, it's included. It's going to highlight for you green or red. You'd continue through. You'd say my construction activities are window restoration and masonry repair. Enter in the cost. We're going to say it's going to be $80,000 and $20,000. And yes, these things are all included in the grant project. However, you may have a larger project too that's including some site work that's not eligible. And we're going to say wrought iron fence repair. Not eligible for SPG, but happening at the same time as these other projects. And that we're going to put in $20,000. Not eligible. So you can see sort of the breakdown of what you have for yes, no, and yes. When you get down to this next section, after you've added in all of your different budget line items, there's an entire project subtotal. What you're going to do here, just move this out of the way, you're going to add up everything that you've entered that has a yes next to it. So super simple. You're going to just grab the category. Oh, here I am. Not super simple. We don't want the one that says a no. You're going to add the categories that say yes and get your subtotal. Automatically, it's going to add a 10% contingency, and it's going to show you the entire project cost. In this case, it's $132,000. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I jumped ahead to the grant request part. This one does include everything. So let me go back. This one, you want to include everything. It's your entire project subtotal, $140,000. It's over 75K, so it is in fact a large project. Now in the grant request determination is where you enter everything where you answered yes above. So we grab the yes, and the yes. There is the size of our grant project, $120,000. We add a contingency. We see the grant project cost of $132,000, and it automatically shows you the 1-for-1 matching breakdown of $66,000 grant share and $66,000 match share. Use the rest of the worksheet to talk about where your match is going to be coming from. So whether there's cash in hand and contributions pledged, other grants that you've already received, other grants that you've already applied for. Someone asked about that earlier. We do want to see that an application is out there, so you definitely want to include that. And then what that's going to show you after you enter all that here is how much match you have in hand and how much match is left to be provided. So say you have $50,000 in hand already, and you've applied for a grant of, $10,000. That's going to show that you still have a match deficit that you need to raise. If you have other funds already in hand or other grants that you have applied for, also describe that here. So if right here, the $10,000 grant that you applied for is from Champlin, you'd say Champlin, $10,000, and the date available, December 2021, if awarded. Explain your plans sort of in this narrative field about how you would raise additional funds for the project. And if you have eligible prior expenditures, you can talk about them here. What are eligible prior expenditures? For a project that is currently in progress and you have expenditures that have happened within the last calendar year, you may apply to us to have those counted towards your matching commitment. We cannot reimburse them using the grant. We cannot say for projects that have before the application was approved that those would be eligible for grant reimbursement. We may be able to accept them as match. This is super rare. I can remember doing this twice in the past 2015, 2016, and 2017 grant rounds. It happened twice. So if you think that you might have that, call me or email me first and we'll talk about whether or not those might be eligible. So the small project budget grant looks exactly the same. The worksheet functions exactly the same. The only difference is these formulas that break down match. One thing I will show you here using the large project budget, we talked about how if your project is very big and you're applying for the maximum grant amount of $150,000, the balance will be sort of allocated to match, even if it exceeds $150,000. So for example, if all of those costs we had entered before added up to, what am I doing? We'll put in a $500,000 project. You'll see how this automatically gave you the maximum of $150,000 with a matching share required of $400,000. So just something to keep in mind. Any questions about the budget worksheet?
Yes, we have a bunch of questions.
sure.
I just wanted to let Anthony, Betsy, Betty, and Randy know that we're going to get to your questions in a bit, but we're going to focus on our budget questions now.
Okay.
So Ryan wants to know what level of specificity is required for the budget worksheet. For instance, we're requesting a roof replacement and we have a quote from a contractor who has worked on the roof in the past. However, it isn't itemized by labor, materials, etc.
That's okay. So, you could put it sort of as a sum up category. Later, if we were to award that project a grant, we would definitely want to see sort of a scope of work and budget in the grant agreement that was sort of specified by materials and labor and all of that. But for purposes of the application, you can just include, roof replacement, contractor's fees, and kind of have it rolled up. That's okay.
Okay, and then one question you've already answered, so we're going to ask another from Kathleen. How do you define cash in hand? Great question.
So cash in hand is money in the bank. So it is in your hands as we speak. If it's a grant that's been awarded from another organization and you have not, physically received it yet, let us know in that section. Where are we here? Other grants supporting this work and date available. So you would have to let us know when it was available. But cash in hand is in hand now as we speak.
Okay, it looks like I'm going to table the rest of these questions for your next section.
Okay,
We'll move on.
perfect. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so we will go back to the presentation. Talked about the budget worksheet and walked through that as well. So lastly here on the application, we're going to talk about the review process. So basically this is what happens when we first receive the applications. We're going to do a check-in at the staff level for eligibility and completeness. Once that's taken care of, there's going to be that formal evaluation by staff and by the review panel. Who is the review panel? So the review panel are experts that have been appointed by the commission to review these grants. It's a panel of 7 preservation professionals, a representative from RIHPHC, and a staff representative from our office who will review all of the applications according to the criteria, which we'll discuss in a minute. They will make final recommendations to the commission itself, and the commission has final say. They will vote to approve the funded applications, most likely at their December meeting. So the evaluation criteria. Each eligible application is going to be evaluated by the review panel on the following criteria for a total of 50 points. These are architectural and historical significance. This criteria measures the relative historical and architectural significance of your properties. Project need, which measures the physical needs of the historical property. Impact measures the support for the project and the extent to which it will benefit the audiences you serve and people who live in your community. Distribution, which tries to ensure equitable distribution of funded projects to communities statewide. And capacity to succeed, which assesses your own organizational strength and the likelihood that you'll be able to complete a successful grant project. This full rubric, very detailed, is also available on the SPG page of our website. Highly recommend downloading it and reviewing it as part of your review before you begin the application. Be responsive to the best of your ability to the criteria listed on that document. Again, like Sarah said earlier, your application is your argument. So use those as a guideline to sort of inform how you answer those narrative fields in the application. That'll be the best thing for helping, facilitate conversations among the reviewers as they rank your projects. So the calendar, applications are due October 1st, 2021. We expect award decisions by December 31st, by the end of the year. And then funding agreements will be signed in 2022 for 2-year project periods. Questions about the application or review process?
Okay, so we have some more here. Actually, about timing, that's in the next section? Nope, actually, I think I'm going to hold these for the next section
Okay.
of questions. And I just want to say that Jeff Emity and Virginia Haas have joined us. We're going to bring them in if we have some Q&A later among us all.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, next on the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the requirements of a grant if you do receive a grant from this program. So if you receive a grant, you're going to have a contract with us that's called the funding agreement. And this is going to detail all the grant requirements, your scope of work, your budget, and a schedule for the project. Included among those requirements are the requirement that the property owner must grant the state of RI and the commission a historic preservation easement. So the easement will require that the property receiving grant assistance is maintained for a term of years without alteration, except as approved in writing by RIHPHC. This easement has a 10-year term for small project grants and a 25-year term for large project grants. If you have an existing easement on your property and there is a term of years remaining, if that term of years exceeds either 10 for small projects or 25 years for large projects, you do not have to sign a new easement. If, for example, you've received a large project grant and you have 20 years left on your 25-year term, you will sign an amendment that adds 5 years to that existing easement to make sure that we are covering that 25-year required term as a condition of receiving the grant. There are some other exceptions too. Obviously, if you have a perpetuity easement in place already, no action needed. If the property is owned by the state or the federal government, there's some other exceptions we can delve into there as well. And you can contact me directly if that's your case. But that's the easement requirement. Competitive procurement and contractor qualifications. So construction contracts for SPG funded projects must be competitively awarded. In most cases, this is an RFP process, and you will be proactively soliciting multiple contractor bids for your project. Contractors must have appropriate historic preservation experience, so we'll require them to submit a qualification statement with their bids, and project plans and specs must be approved by one of our staff architects prior to bid. Contracts themselves must also be reviewed and approved by us prior to finalization before the contractor can proceed. prevailing wage and the MBE program. So prevailing wage is required for public projects. These would be those at properties that are state or municipally owned. If you have a state or city town owned property, definitely make sure you're being very careful about your project estimates, because prevailing wage will make those estimates go up. So check that out ahead of time for sure. Additionally, state law has requirements regarding the Minority Business Enterprise Program. So it requires that 10% of the value of all state-funded construction contracts is awarded to MBE certified contractors. So contractors bidding on SPG projects have to make every effort to meet that 10% goal. And if unable to meet the goal, a waiver has to be obtained from the state's MBE office. That's again something that you can ask me about directly if you don't have experience with it, but a lot of you probably already do as well. Project sign, this is a fun one. So we're going to provide you a project sign that has to be displayed in a visible location for the duration of the grant project, and then you get to keep it as a nice memento at the end of the day. And so for project monitoring and reimbursement, this is just a good chance to remind you that SPG grants are reimbursement grants. So in the case of receiving a grant, you will pay contractor invoices upfront, then submit the receipts to us for review and to receive the grant share reimbursement of that piece. Our staff architects will monitor project progress and visit project sites prior to signing off on these reimbursements. Any questions about grant terms, requirements, or any of the other things we had to defer?
All right, now we've got a bunch of questions lined up for you.
Great.
About timing. So Anthony had asked, if we are to receive a grant, is there a time limit to use the grant?
Yep, it's 2 years. It's 2 years.
Okay.
So we can entertain requests for extensions at the end of a 2-year period if there's, a legitimate reason for the project not having been completed within 2 years, and we do award extensions, but the contract you'll sign will have a 2-year project period.
Okay, and I'm seeing a related question just come in from Ryan about Champlin also using a 2-year term. So should we still use a 2-year timeline as our guide? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Betsy Hyman asks, what is the duration of the availability of these funds? Will there be other grant opportunities made available?
Oh, great question. So at this time, we anticipate only having one grant round with the bond that was approved in 2021. So we'll have about $1 million to award. We expect to award it all or obligate it all in this current grant round. And then we're hopeful for a future bond issue, potentially on the 2022 November ballot. But none of that is set in stone yet. So as far as we know right now, it's a one-shot deal till we get another bond funded.
And Betty's question was very similar. If we're not ready in October, will there be a future round? And Katie just answered that. A couple more questions. One from Diane Vaughn. The land is owned by the state, but the building is owned by our nonprofit. Do we need DEM to sign the preservation easement?
So Diane, Coggeshall is a former state preservation grant recipient. And I believe what we've done in the past is just done sort of a letter of agreement, because the state cannot take an easement on the state. And yes, you are located within a state park. And we have, I believe, so the commission has review over the state property just based on the State Historic Preservation Act as it is. So there won't be a formal easement executed for that property.
Okay, another ownership question from Brenda. We own our property and the buildings on it. Do I need to be concerned with preservation easement language? I am not clear on this.
I'm not clear on the question. The owner, can you say that one again?
We own our property and the buildings on it. Do I need to be concerned with preservation easement language?
Oh, so yes. So if you're applying for that building, as the owner, you will grant the commission an easement to agreeing to preserve that building as a condition of receiving the grant. Yep.
Okay, from Alicia, your website states that applicants should submit an email of intent prior to submitting an application. Is this a required step in the process or simply a recommendation? Not
required, but yes, a recommendation. And I'm still accepting those. So I've gotten I checked this morning, it was almost 30. So there's definitely a lot of interest out there. It's helpful, especially if you are unsure about your eligibility, whether it's eligibility of the organization itself, the building itself, or the project. It can be really, really helpful to take a look at that ahead of time. So I'm definitely still willing to read and review your letters of intent. I looked this morning, I think I've gotten back to just about everybody. There might be 1 or 2 or 3 that came in this week that I haven't gotten back to yet, but I am on it, and I'll make sure that if you've submitted one, we'll definitely give you some feedback as soon as we can.
Okay, and one more question from Cindy at Borders Farm. The historic property is accessible to all those who can walk. Is a ramp acceptable for entry and exit? Also, the interior is limited by doorway widths. How does this affect us?
Right, so this is what we run into with ADA and historic properties. We don't necessarily want you to modify, character defining features of your property for ADA access, but we definitely would like you to explore other options. So if there are other things that you do to sort of bring the visitor experience outside, let us know, because that's just great to know about, what you offer. But no, you won't be disqualified because of a 2-foot doorway opening. That's just something that we deal with historic properties, and it's not going to be a disqualification whatsoever.
We have another question in the Q&A. What is the minimum number of contractor bids required, and must prevailing wage requirement be met?
Prevailing wage has to be met for properties that are owned by the state or municipal agencies. So if you're not owned by a public agency, no prevailing wage, but you must include prevailing wage if you are a publicly owned property. And then the other piece was, minimum number of bids. We tried, the goal is at least 3. If you don't get 3, you don't get 3, but you have to take extremely proactive measures to do what you can to get at least 3.
Great. And one more question I see. What is the deadline for submitting the suggested email of intent?
We didn't put a deadline on it. I mean, I would hope that anyone who is still thinking about it but hasn't fully decided if they want to apply, that you could send me one at least by the end of next week, because the time frame for application is pretty short. They are due October 1. If we get a letter of intent, on September 28th, and there's a lot of questions, or we need to figure it out, it could be a little challenging for you. So we didn't put a formal deadline on it since it's not a requirement, but I would say, try and get that done by next week at the latest.
I think you're clear.
Okay. So next steps, this is pretty much it. Our website has all of the information for applications. It has links to the portal for RIHPHC. It has downloadables, including the question list of the application. If you just want to be able to look at the questions and sort of think about them and prepare your answers before you get into the form and start typing, that can be really helpful. It also has a copy or a link to our program regulations, which can be helpful to review, guidelines, and those budget worksheets and other forms that you want to download for attachment to the application. So definitely check out that link and familiarize yourself with all of those materials. Like we just said, not too late for an email of intent. Would love to see more of those within the next week if you have them. And then that is pretty much it. You're going to gather all your supporting documentation and complete the application by October 1st. Contact me, absolutely, if you have any issues in the portal itself while you're putting together the application, or any issues with the budget worksheet. That actually reminds me, I forgot to mention, in the budget worksheet, because of those formulas and things that are built in there, we have tweaked a few things since the application was first released. So when you log on to our website, you'll see that the budget worksheets were revised, I think, September 6th. If you downloaded the sheet before then, best bet is to re-download the one that's there now and use those ones to complete your application. We did have correspondence with an applicant who was having some difficulty in the budget worksheet, and we were able to fix some issues in there that made it, I think, a lot easier and a lot clearer for everyone. So I would definitely go back and re-download those if you had been really excited and download them in late August. Okay, so I think that's good. If anyone else has any final questions, happy to entertain them.
I thought that maybe everybody else on the commission, we could all turn on our cameras and say hello. There is one more question from David Bacharach in East Providence.
Mhm.
What if we get a bid that is over the budget available?
So I believe we say in our grant agreements that if the bid you receive exceeds what you have available by 10% or less, that's kind of on you. That's on you to sort of find the balance to go for that. If it exceeds by over 10%, you may be eligible to apply for a increase if funding is available. Do not know how much we will have in reserve available for additional funds, but you are potentially able to apply for more money if it's there. Try and get those estimates as best as you can. I know it's tricky and that stuff always comes back, where you didn't expect, but that's definitely a challenge. It is a challenge for everybody. Anything else?
Looks like we don't have any more questions, but if people want to stick around, commission staff are here to answer questions. I could always move you up into the Zoom room. Just let us know in the chat if you'd like to ask your question one-on-one.
Sarah, it looks like Jeff is unable to turn his video on, and I'm not sure if that's the case for our colleagues as well. Do you know if you can enable him?
In the meantime, while you look at that, Sarah, I see a question from Betsy saying, if there are additional funds, how will they be distributed? So we're not likely, like I said before, to do an additional grant round. Anything that's left over after awarding these applications is bound to be a pretty small balance. And we're most likely to hold that in reserve in case there are projects that have overruns and need to come back and ask for more money. So it's very unlikely that there will be another round of this bond funding. Hoping we'll get another bond, next election cycle. But at the moment, we don't have plans for that yet.
I'm not sure why people aren't able to show their faces, but just keep trying. Nice to see you, Jeff and Liz.
Morning.
So I'm seeing another one here that says, do we need a minimum of 3 bids? You need to try your hardest to get at least 3 bids. So basically what I mean by that is if you solicit bids openly and competitively and you only receive 2, I'm just going to want to see evidence of sort of the active promotion and solicitation for the bid opportunity, that everyone had, a chance to bid on it. If you only get 2, you only get 2, but we can't have someone just only go ask 2 contractors for a bid. We need to make sure that we're trying our hardest to get as many, opportunities as possible.
And there's a question from Pawtucket about $75,000 match. Would that be a large grant?
It would, if that's the match available and you've got a larger project to handle. Yeah, it would.
Westerly Armory is asking, does dehumidification and our water penetration mitigation in the basement area qualify, knowing the space will be used by community room plus museum expansion?
Yes, that would be eligible, especially if it's going to be a programmed space. And if it's not a programmed space already, you'd want to use the application to make a really good argument for how, upon completion of the project, that space would be programmed and accessible by the public.
Before we go to the rest of the questions, Ginger, you had a comment you wanted to relay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I wanted to respond to a question that was asked previously about a contractor's quote, who knows the project. And it was specifically about whether they had to break it down as labor and materials, but no, your answer was correct, but we do need to have a fairly detailed description of the work they propose. Like, are they going to remove the roof to the substrate? Are they going to repair the substrate? Are they going to put down an underlayment? If so, what is the underlayment? Are they going to add insulation? And if so, what kind of insulation? So we do need to know that. The bid, the quote should be specific about the work that they're going to do.
Absolutely. And the place to put all that is in the application form. So in the budget worksheet itself, that can all be rolled up, like we were saying, but in those narrative fields where we talk about the project description in the application form, absolutely, we're going to want to see, all those details about the scope that Ginger just mentioned.
Thank you.
And I just promoted Renee Gava. If you want to ask your question.
Just unmute myself.
Thanks.
So thanks so much. So as you know, we received a lot of support for the Preservation Commission, so we're excited to see this. Right now we have a lot of SIP funding supporting complete restoration, including our doors, even some areas that have been compromised that we repaired, the water mitigation, because this is kind of a big project, and the large grant would be what we would be going for to kind of continue with the progression of our doors, making them historic and all that. Would that fit, or does it need to be something very separate, or can this be to help supplement a current restoration project that's currently happening?
It can be for a project that's currently in progress. That's one I'd probably want to have like an offline individual conversation with you about, because like I mentioned, if it's for a project that's currently in progress, there might be the ability to claim current expenditures towards match. So I don't, there's no prohibition on a project that's in progress, but it does just, make things a little trickier. So I would love to have a conversation with you about that.
Okay, I was going to send an email, but I know kind of with the deadline, and our biggest issue is ADA with our doors and restoring them also, so that they're in terms of keeping with the historic integrity of the building. So that's one of the pieces that's kind of part of this project that we won't be able to do because of the other kind of support needed. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense, because if it's a piece that you'd like to accomplish with the ongoing project, but you don't have the funding to do it or to include it in the current scope, it actually would be a natural fit to apply for a grant and to keep it going. Yeah.
And I was a few minutes late, so I thank you, because again, it's a little bit trickier, and I just wanted to kind of focus my energy and make sure that that would be welcome. So thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
It looks like we have no more questions in the comments, but if anybody wants to stick around, think of a question, here's your chance. You've got architects and historians, grant administrator, and RIHPHC, our friends, ready
I
to
actually
answer
see
your question.
one from Ryan that we didn't get to. I'm
Oh, okay.
scrolling back a little bit here. Ryan asks, if you have any leftover money, can you apply to do work related to the project, i.e. replacing the drop ceiling panels in the interior after the roof replacement? Possibly. So the reason I say possibly there is because if it's directly related to the ongoing project and it can be added into the scope, and potentially like it would make more sense if the leftover was known about at the bid stage. So what I mean by that is you get a grant, you have your estimate, you go out to bid, you receive bids, and the contract that you're going to pick, the contractor you're going to pick, their bid is under what you have available. In that case, we can talk about potentially adding a task. I'm a little unsure about just at the very end adding things on. We do have a lot of projects that do have cost overruns. So if you accomplish your project under budget, that's a good thing. We may want to put that money back in reserve for projects that go over. So it's a toss up there. It would definitely be case by case basis, Ryan.
And we have another question from Westerly Armory about the email of intent. And she was
when is it due? Yeah,
with tourists. I love that.
That's great. I'm glad. Try and get an email of intent to me by the end of next week. I think it's not a formal requirement, so I'm not going to put a formal deadline on it, but I think you'll be best served if you can get that in by the end of next week. Okay. Oh, no deadline, Roberta. No deadline. ASAP. I'll type it in.
To remind everybody, we will post a link to the video. We can make available Katie's slide deck, and we'll have that up on our website by the end of the week.
Great. Okay, everyone.
Oh, there's a question from
Oh.
Cindy at Borders Farm, who says they have a local contractor with a lot of experience in historic preservation. Does he need to be licensed with the standards you laid out?
Well, all contractors have to be licensed with the state of Rhode Island. I do check that when we receive bids and make sure I go into the contractor's licensing and registration board and make sure everybody is licensed. In terms of qualified, they do have to have appropriate preservation experience. This will vary wildly depending on the project. So for an extremely technical terracotta roof replacement, we're going to make sure that we require in the RFP for that project that the potential bidders have experience on extremely technical, complicated terracotta roofs. Same doesn't go for every project. So for a project, Cindy at like Borders Farm, the experience will be different, but we will require that they have experience. Okay.
We're getting to the end.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for all of your really excellent questions. I think it helps everybody when we get to hear what's on your mind. Probably a lot of the other applicants have those same questions in mind as well.
Definitely. All right. Look forward to seeing the applications. Take care.